my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Losh. Elizabeth is an associate professor of English and American Studies at William and Mary with a specialization in new media ecologies. She's the author most recently of The War on Learning, Gaining Ground in the Digital University, MIT Press 2014, and hashtag Bloomsbury 2019. She's the editor of MOOCs and Their Afterlives, Experiments in Scale and Access in Higher Education, University of Chicago 2017, and co-editor with Jacqueline Wernemont, another one of our featured speakers, Bodies of Information, Intersectional Feminism and Digital Humanities, Minnesota 2018. She has also written a number of frequently cited essays about communities that produce, consume, and circulate online video games, digital photographs, text postings, and programmatic code. I'd like to welcome Liz. She'll be speaking today first on Hacking Academic Selves, the Equality Lab at William and Mary. And then just so you know, after Liz speaks, I will introduce Darren Wershler, our other speaker, and we're going to be playing a pre-recorded presentation from him at that time, and then doing Q&A, and Darren will be participating on Zoom.
I'm so delighted to be here. I'd like to start, of course, by thanking Maya, Thea, and Lori for all the infrastructural care and repair that goes into these kinds of scholarly conversations. I often think that this is a kind of labor that is so undervalued in the academy, given its centrality, so thank you for bringing us here. And the other thing I'd like to point out is this is going to be a much less scripted presentation than presentations that I normally give. That's intentional. And the reason is I'm going to be talking a lot about the work of early career scholars working in the Equality Lab, and I don't want to make it seem like their scholarly explorations are somehow frozen in amber. And so if you are a person of the future looking back at this conference and watching this video, I'd like to say that it's really important to say that this is not taxidermied work that I want to sort of capture as a lifeless thing. I want to talk about it as ongoing work that's protean, that's developing, that's evolving, and as many of us who are perhaps more senior scholars know, academic inquiry can take many different twists and turns. And so I wouldn't want this to seem to define the work that they're doing. Although I did consult with them to talk about this. And I am cool with live tweeting, and in fact I put people's Twitter handles up to encourage that activity. So first, I want to acknowledge the fact that knowledge is co-constructed. And a lot of the work that I've done as a scholar and the work directing the Equality Lab has to do with a series of collaborations. So on the first and second row, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow former co-facilitators of FemTechNet. That's Alexandra Yuhas, Ann Balsamo, Lisa Nakamura, Sharon Irish, Paula Gardner, Jasmine Rout, T.L. Cohen, Veronica Paredes, Ann Kong-Win, who've all done important work directing FemTechNet. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-instructors at the Feminist Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the DHSI. So that's Ann Kong-Win, who's also has been a co-facilitator of FemTechNet, Jessica Marie Johnson, and Jacqueline Wernemont. And of course, Jacqueline Wernemont and I have also collaborated around a number of essays and also co-edited Bodies of Information together. And I should point out that there was a mistake on Bodies of Information. Jacqueline Wernemont's name should be first on the cover. And so if you can just sort of mentally Photoshop the cover of that book in your mind and put Jacqueline Wernemont's name first, I would be most grateful. I'd also like to acknowledge my FemTechNet co-instructor, Lisa Cartwright, the people who I've worked closely with on issues of studying online activism, especially Beth Coleman, thinking about human rights work in digital media, working with Sam Gregory, working with Nishant Shah on the bottom right here, on fake news and simulation. Celia Pierce, who is my co-editor of the Media Origins book series at MIT Press. And finally, in the lower right-hand corner, Jonathan Alexander, who is my co-author of Understanding Rhetoric and works a lot on rhetorical projects with me. And of course, it's also important to show that there are male feminists that. So when we think about what it means to talk about feminism and technology together, often there's a tendency to think that means women and computers. And one of the things that FemTechNet has tried to do is to think about ways we can understand those myths. And so this is the so-called MEALS framework that Jacqueline Wernemont and I often use as a way to try to talk about what we mean when we say feminist theories of technology. So that means thinking about how technology is material, although it's often presented as virtual or transcendent, how it involves embodiment, although it's often presented as disembodied, how technology solicits affect, although it's often presented as highly rational. Anybody who's ever watched that angry German kid video with the child becoming irritated with the video game knows that technology solicits affect. Technology requires labor, although it's often presented as labor saving. How many of us encounter a new labor-saving technology from the university and realize right away that just the labor is being moved elsewhere? It's not really actually disappearing. The technology is situated in particular contexts, although it's often presented as universal, and it promotes particular values, although it's often presented as neutral. So today I'm going to divide up my discussion of the Equality Lab into 3 topics: situations and spaces, tools and platforms, and technologies of the self. So I'd like to start by reading a little bit from the kind of position statement of the Equality Lab. So the Equality Lab provides an environment to foster collaborative and interdisciplinary research by using digital tools to answer fundamental questions about the nature of equality across many different domains. It recognizes that the concept of equality itself presents us with a contested and volatile term that urges testing, experimenting, tinkering, and questioning among members of research communities. So, and I can talk in the Q&A about how difficult it was to choose a name. Most of the people who are in the Equality Lab actually do inequality research, but we thought that Inequality Lab would probably be too much of a bummer, and funders wouldn't want to give us any money. And we're also mindful of the difference between equality and equity and issues about the sort of diversity industrial complex. But we really felt strongly that in some ways using equality as a term that was really problematic, as a term that implies a certain kind of quantitative justice that we were interrogating, it was actually important to use that term. So I'll start with talking about situations and spaces and kind of what gets to count as a lab, and the ways that labs make certain kinds of labor visible, particularly that labor of knowledge production that Maya was talking about. So one of the humorous things about the Equality Lab is we can't get any of the signage to be correct. It all says the Equality Center, which is actually kind of funny because centers, we just, apparently a center is a very special sort of shrine-like designation at the university. And if you have a center, that means you're a much fancier person. So our signage actually indicates that we are much more special than we actually are. And it's interesting to me that certain things get called labs and there's not a problem with it. So for example, this is my Diplomacy Lab course that I'm teaching in conjunction with the State Department. It's called Influencers, Activists, and Trolls, and it's about social media in Turkey. And because the State Department has this Diplomacy Lab moniker, right, this is acknowledged as being a lab. This is what a lab looks like, even though when the university did a promotional video about the Diplomacy Lab, everybody had handouts that day, because I had worked really hard on putting together those handouts. And so it was, what a lab looks like and what are the sort of visual optics of a lab is something that I want to actually kind of undermine in certain ways. So in thinking about institutional branding, we had to think about what we wanted the Equality Lab to look like as a space. And of course, our space looks nothing like this, right? This is a visual representation of Wren Hall, which is the oldest building on campus. So it's a kind of imagined 18th century space that doesn't actually correspond to the space that we have in Morton Hall. This is our actual space, and these are Equality Lab members celebrating Galentine's Day on Valentine's Day with a big board game night. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is create spaces and situations where people can appropriate the space to use in the ways that they wish. And that includes creating possibilities for mess and failure, and recognizing mess and failure as being part of the process of knowledge production. So this is what was supposed to be a 2D plotter project that was created by one of the Equality Lab fellows, Convo. And she wrote a really eloquent blog post about sort of what it means when your makerspace produces things like this. You know, when you have this sort of waste product that's sort of beautiful and aesthetic, but obviously a disaster. And in fact, a few minutes after this photograph was taken, so these are Equality Lab fellows who are out flying our drone in the abandoned Dillon campus spaces of the university. And as part of a project that was about the non-human residents of the university, where we were looking at how other kinds of living things had moved into this abandoned part of campus, and using the drone to be able to sort of spot activities in abandoned buildings that human beings weren't allowed to go in. So just a few minutes after this exciting experience of piloting a drone for the first time, the drone flew into a tree and was stuck there. And so me and a half dozen Equality Lab fellows were sort of looking up at this drone that had cost several $1,000s that was stuck in the tree, trying to figure out what to do. And one of the graduate students offered to clamber up the tree, and I was, of course, like, no, as the faculty mentor, we're not doing anything that would possibly cause you to fall out of this tree and be harmed. So the fellows actually created this very elaborate mechanism that involved poles and other things. I think it involved a very large tree branch to try to get the drone out of the tree, and then they caught it in this improvised trampoline that they had created from a blanket. So it was sort of a beautiful moment of experimentation. I've been inspired by looking at a lot of other feminist labs. And I'd like to point out that Stephanie Wuschitz, who runs Ms. Balthazar's laboratory in Vienna, is actually coming to the Equality Lab on May 1st and 2nd to sort of talk to us about feminist hackerspaces and a lot of the work that she's done around the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experiences with labs and labs that I've interacted with and been a part of. And I'd like to start by sort of expressing my gratitude to Tara McPherson for the work that she did with the NEH Vectors Summer Institute at the University of California. And the ways that that kind of lab experience, both working with a kind of traditional media editing lab space with computers, but also more provisional experiments that involve critical making, and hacking, in one case, toys, so doing circuit bending activities that involve solder. I'm the world's worst solderer, by the way, which now Tara and everyone else knows, but I think that kind of environment of feminist experimentation that McPherson has really facilitated is something that I feel very privileged to have experienced earlier in my career. A lot of my thinking about lab work has also been shaped by collaborations around the Feminist Digital Humanities workshop at the Digital Humanities Summer Institute. And you can see Jacqueline Wernemont there. Now, one of the things we do is we use the programming language processing as a way to get people to feel less inhibited about code and the ways that algorithmic processes function. Processing is an accessible language for artists and hobbyists that has a relatively large user base. And so you can see here people messing around with Arduinos trying to get a light to blink. And that might seem like a relatively low stakes activity, but it's surprising how many people feel more able to interact with things that they're afraid of by having a sort of low stakes, high humor interaction with technology. And we have relatively simple exercises as a way to sort of start getting into thinking about code. So for example, what does it take in order to take this exercise where you have this sort of Pac-Man character running this way, to instead of going side to side, just go up and down, right? And then, maybe think about the Pac-Man's gender in new ways, using color and other things that you might want to do. You can have a whole field of Pac people all over the visual field. But we also have used processing as a way to facilitate discussions about forms of structural oppression and ways that we can think about code as creating playable systems where we can talk about forces that act on different kinds of actors in the world. So for example, a really interesting discussion emerged about how people thought about forces and gravity and attraction and repulsion, and went through the code libraries in processing to try to figure out ways to visualize or model the forms of oppression that they were sort of seeing in their lived experience. Another thing that's really informed my thinking is rapid prototyping workshops. And I've done rapid prototyping workshops in 4 different countries. This is a rapid prototyping workshop at Transmediale in Germany. But as you can see, I've done a lot of these over the years. And the general prompt is, and I was very influenced by the work of Garnet Hertz on critical making, and so I'd like to give a shout out to Hertz's work on critical making. Because I do think rapid prototyping as a technique used in industry favors a certain kind of user-centered design that isn't always feminist. And so I like to give people prompts where I say, we're going to create imagined feminist technologies. And the prompts might be something like, create a labor-saving device for a form of invisible labor. Or create a life support system for a type of life that goes beyond just bare life. Or create a survival kit with survival tools that involves helping an entity survive that might be a non-human agent. So for example, one of these groups actually worked on what would a survival kit for privacy to survive look like. And from these workshops, there might be other kinds of unanticipated outputs. So for example, this is a blog post by Roxanne Shirazi, who participated in one of the rapid prototyping workshops that took place at Barnard. And she wrote about thinking about the labor of speaking and what it means to be a parent of a disabled child, and the ways that she thought about technological mediation when she was thinking about this sort of imagined feminist technology, and what it means both to speak for yourself and to speak for others. Now, another lab experience that I had from 2010 to maybe 2013 was being part of the Software Studies Lab at UC San Diego, which was a really interesting opportunity to work with very large data sets. I'm working on a project, as many of you know, about looking at social media in the Obama and Trump administrations, and that's a very large data set to look at. When you're trying to look at things like how did Trump learn to use emojis, and looking through 37,000 tweets, sometimes it's handy to have some of these methodologies for thinking about cultural data. And working with Lev Manovich, it was certainly interesting to kind of think about the possibilities of using a cultural analytics lens to imagine ways that new forms of scholarly inquiry could be mapped, visualized, and made accessible to others. That said, I found myself with some deep philosophical disagreements. And people at the lab are aware of that. But certainly projects like Selfie Cities that promise to visualize content from thousands of selfies in 5 cities around the world. I mean, you notice one of the things that they're trying to do is sort of map age. They also map gender. And the ways that this sort of felt like a kind of non-consent given surveillance was deeply troubling to me. And instead, I took a lot more satisfaction being part of the group of feminist scholars who put together this selfie course, who created open access materials for people to think about pedagogical and community-based activities involving selfies around the world, including people like Marion Walton, working with the Kamva Youth Organization outside of Cape Town to use the same digital humanities tools, including image plot, that were used in the Software Studies Lab directed by Manovich, but instead having them be used by subjects in ways over which they had more agency. And sort of similarly, thinking about political unrest and the demonstrations against Viktor Yanukovych, looking at the sort of scraping of data by political participants in Independence Square, and the ways that the Software Studies Lab was identifying heavily used hashtags, I found myself really wanting to look at the situated experiences of digital media production and really provide a kind of richer set of data rather than merely sort of harvest this data without talking to participants or being part of their community. And this is some of the research that I'll be presenting in the hashtag book that will be out in September. I do think it's valuable to think of data as an object of study in the lab environment, but I tend to be more interested in little data than in big data. Little data is what Christine Borgman calls the data that humanities scholars often work with, and it might not be as sort of impressive in scale and scope as big data initiatives, but that data at the human scale can still be important. And I think part of what Borgman does is she asks us to think about certain ethical questions about sharing, releasing, and reusing data, about credit, attribution, and discovery of data, and what to keep and why. And I think scholars like Moya Bailey, who've talked about community-informed consent, have really raised good issues about how we think about data. And certainly, I tend to be one of those people who thinks of myself more as somebody in critical data studies rather than data science, even though I do appear on the masthead for the data science program at William & Mary. As an open peer reviewer of the book Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, which I would recommend you guys look at the MIT website. And also in Bodies of Information, which will soon be available, open access from the University of Minnesota Press. So that brings me to tools and platforms. And my thinking about tools and platforms has really been informed by feminist science and technology studies work, thinking about lab spaces. And so I think the work by people like Adele Clark and Joan Fujimura, in their book, The Right Tools for the Job, they say we have to interrogate rightness, we have to interrogate what a tool is, and we have to interrogate what jobs we think we're accomplishing. And that they try to sort of point out the ways that craft work and provisionality and impromptu arrangements and improvisation are all important parts of the lab environment. So since my lab is part of the Digital Humanities Initiative on the William & Mary campus, that means I have to think about digital humanities authoring platforms. So for example, using a proprietary technology, the Esri Story Maps platform, Sachi Carlson has created a really interesting project looking at Virginia conservancy efforts. And in particular, Carlson is interested in how these late 19th century and early 20th century initiatives to save sites like Mount Vernon, not only how they were tied to anti-Black animus, but also how they were tied to anti-immigrant animus. And so this desire to sort of create an Anglo-Saxon past that would be more white than perceived visible whiteness is a sort of interesting intellectual exercise that she's using the Esri interface to explore. I'd also point out the work of Sharday Reed, who's a PhD candidate in the anthropology department, who's been looking, it's the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans being brought to North America and landing at the Jamestown settlement. And Reed tries to think through their stories. She's also uncovering the stories of the Black archaeologists who did the initial excavations in the 1920s, as she's sort of uncovering the stories of these early Africans. And as a Black archaeologist herself, she's trying to think through these questions of identity work. A project like Empire of Fashion that looks at the diffusion of fashion items between colonizers and colonized in New World spaces is a really interesting one too, that's using the Omeka platform. And part of her reasoning for using Omeka S is it made it much easier for her to create a bilingual site. Because as a scholar from Columbia, she wanted to make sure that there wasn't a US intellectual hegemony over this scholarship. And so that scholars who were actually from the regions, often where these items had been expropriated from and put in US collections, could be part of the discussion. And finally, I think it's useful to look at platforms like Scalar, again, that were developed at Feminist Lab, and the ways that they get used by different kinds of communities. So for example, I'd point out Adrienne Richard's work that looks at bringing together ethnic studies, disability studies, and fan studies, looking at the ways that we can think about what she calls the blue age of comic books. In other words, how do we think about digital technologies and certain forms of reading accessibility technologies that are part of digital publication, and the ways that they create new communities of interest. So this brings me to the third part of the ways I think about the Equality Lab, which I'm really interested in this question of how digital labs can allow certain kinds of experimentation with technologies of the self. And obviously, I'm borrowing here from Michel Foucault's work on the subject, where he argues that Western subjectivity and technological engagement can't necessarily be disambiguated. And I'm also thinking through technologies of the self through a feminist lens. For example, by using things like Jill Walker-Retberg's Seeing Ourselves Through Technology, how we use selfies, blogs, and wearable devices to see and shape ourselves. So how do we think about seeing ourselves through technology when we think of technologies of the self? Now, I've written a bit about Hope Jahren and talked about her memoir, The Lab Girl. I believe when I talked about the Equality Lab at the Digital Humanities conference in Mexico City, I talked a little bit about this research. I think the more I think about Lab Girl as a book, the more I think that the experimental subject is Jahren herself in the lab as much as it is about her scientific research. And the memoir, in some ways, is the ways that she works out the story of her mental illness and decides how to narrate it for a particular kind of public. So I'd like to use the remainder of my time to talk about how Equality Lab fellows are using the space and the situations, the tools and the platforms as ways to sort of think through these questions of technologies of the self, and ways that they're actually hacking academic identities in ways that might be more difficult to do in the conventional scholarly route. So for example, Jennifer Ross has been an active member in digital humanities efforts, attending Python boot camps, going to the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, and she's working on thinking about the politics of disaster by looking at literary works created about September 11th and the disastrous flooding after Hurricane Katrina. But she's interested in also figuring out ways that those literary works can be correlated with particular kinds of data points to support her argument that the anti-terror surveillance state and supposedly humanitarian disaster response became closely interconnected in responses to the Hurricane Katrina disaster. And that can sound like kind of a paranoid argument to make when you're really talking about a kind of government as a bad actor scenario. And yet Ross does a very effective job sort of showing how these particular points created for disaster response were actually coordinated with anti-terror scenarios and simulations that had been run in the past in Katrina. And she looks very closely at how particular people's homes, how the ways that they might have been detained or arrested, the ways that that plays out in the sort of geography of social space. And she also then correlates that data with information about flood depths and then information about racial demographics as well. The work of Jessica Cowing is also very important to look at. She's somebody who works on Indian schools, looking at 2 different sites in Pennsylvania and Virginia. But the work that she's doing in the digital humanities has to do with not only thinking about the studies of indigenous people, but also disability studies, and the ways that the bodies of Native people were subject to certain kinds of regimes of normalization. And so her work in the lab has focused on thinking about intersections between disability studies and digital pedagogy, or disability studies and digital humanities. So she's led a series of workshops about how to make Microsoft Word documents or PowerPoint presentations or HTML documents more accessible to those who have disabilities. And that work is also carried on by another member of the Equality Lab, Julia Cott, who actually created a course for course designers to think about accessibility issues and to get beyond the paradigm of accommodation or inclusion. And she's looked at how some of the actual tools being used in the university perpetuate certain kinds of regimes of surveillance, and why we should be critical of certain kinds of digital pedagogy initiatives that are being pushed by vendors. Convo, whose work on 2D plotting I've mentioned before, who thinks about the dehumanization of certain kinds of labor and the ways that the labor of enslaved people, the labor of migrants, and the labor of housewives is often can be understood in terms of discourses about robotics and automation. Has done a lot of really interesting work thinking about the lab as a potential makerspace. And she's also been working a lot in game studies. So for example, she created a course called Cheating that's about taking advantage of different systems of control, where she has students analyze a system and then design a game and then figure out how would people best cheat in that game. And she's been looking a lot at the college admissions scandal lately. Lindsay Garcia created a project called Feminist Pest Control. She's in critical animal studies and part of the lab. She wants to create opportunities for people to think about the stigmatization of pests and the ways that pests get associated with sexual difference, with racial difference, and with gender difference. She's collected oral histories from people who have felt shame about things like bed bugs or lice in order to try to create an archive where these shared stories can destigmatize these interactions with non-human agents. She's also used our campus makerspace to create a cockroach disco. She's done a series of lightning talks where she's experimenting with short form performance of scholarship. And perhaps my favorite Garcia exercise is she shows people how to create granola bars using cockroaches as a high protein source of information. And finally, I'd like to close by talking about the work of Raven Stringfield, who's another Equality Lab fellow. Stringfield has worked on traditional digital humanities projects like this Omeka site created for the Lemon Project that acknowledges the university's participation in slavery and segregation. At the same time, I might argue that her most important laboratory work is the work that she does at Black Girl Does Grad School, where she talks about her participation in academia and the ways that she's trying out new selves. She's creating a public record of scholarly conversations like the My Mother Was a Computer Symposium, or visits by scholars like Rupika Rassam. But she's also exploring ways that the lab could be more accessible to community members and speak more to their interests by including creative digital artists as well. And I think it's important to point out that Raven Stringfield is thinking about herself as a future director of a feminist lab and looking to people like Marissa Parham as potential models that she could emulate. And in that work, she's really modeled academic generosity by having other people come as guest presenters. So with that, thank you.
So I'd like to briefly introduce Darren Wershler. He holds the Concordia University Research Chair in Media and Contemporary Literature and is the co-founder of the Media History Research Center and the director of the Residual Media Depot. Sounds very interesting. He's currently writing the lab book, Situated Practice in Media Studies with Jussi Parikka and our very own Laurie Emerson. Darren's other books include The Iron Whim, A Fragmented History of Typewriting, and Guy Madden's My Winnipeg. Upcoming projects include a book on Minecraft with Bart Simon, and Bodge, a book about the practice, political economy, and culture of video game hardware modification.
The phrase, the extended laboratory, in my title, accomplishes two things. First, it invokes the early 20th century policy project in Western Canada called agricultural extension, the umbrella under which the discipline that was variously called domestic science, household science, home economics, and finally human ecology came into being. And second, it's an opportunity to test out the methodological framework of the lab book, the project I've been working on with my colleagues Laurie Emerson and Jussi Parikka for the last few years. We began the lab book with the conviction that labs are more than a congeries of spaces and apparatus and people. Labs are a site for situated practice, a geographically and historically specific chain of operations and techniques that produces not only knowledge, but also very specific kinds of subjects. Describing that specificity means also paying attention to the factors that literally inform any particular lab. Cultural policy and its attendant infrastructure, but also the lab imaginary, that is, the fantasies, beliefs, and ideologies that provide the lab with its consistency, and the discourses in which that imaginary circulates. The extended laboratory is a useful name for this assemblage rooted in a hugely significant but underexamined history. Like the famed circuit of culture in British cultural studies, a scholar can begin anywhere in our extended lab assemblage as long as their analysis visits all of the other aspects of it along the way. I'm going to begin with the lab site and work outward, but there are other ways to tell this story. For reasons of time, I'll be limiting my scope to roughly the first half of the 20th century. The relative beginnings of domestic science in colonial North America are with Ursuline nuns in Quebec as early as the 17th century. But over the 19th century in Great Britain and the United States, it is the imaginary of modernity that sets the stage for what I am discussing today. Industrialization, the rise of scientific objectivity, women's suffrage, the sovereignty of the individual, changes in pedagogical philosophy. Even the earliest public-facing documents of prairie home economics define its imaginary in terms of scientific method. This 1902 circular from the Winnipeg School of Household Science is worth quoting at length. Household science may be defined as the application of scientific principles and systematic methods of work to the mechanical problems of homemaking. It also embraces the instruction in the science of all the processes carried on in the home, as well as the practical application of these scientific principles to the daily operations of housekeeping. Visual records from the period illustrate how this ideology was put into practice in very concrete ways. The three images I'm starting with are from the University of Manitoba Archives and Special Collections, Faculty of Human Ecology phones. It's worth noting at the outset that we have these images because of the kinds of subject that the discipline of home economics produced via its lab spaces. It's part of the ethos of home economics to keep meticulous records of everything, so this phones is a particularly rich site for researchers. Two other major sources for this project include Johanna Gudrun Wilson's remarkable 1966 MA thesis for the University of Manitoba Faculty of Education and A Time in Our Lives, an equally remarkable privately published collective autoethnography of Manitoba home economics and extension, written by its mid-century alumni and published in 2011. If you're willing to do some digging, the materials in these sources identify not only what is inside various domestic science and home ec labs, but what it cost, where it was sourced, and where it went after new equipment was purchased. What these images depict is the University of Manitoba Home Economics Food Lab between 1914 and 1915. The first image, shot from a slightly different angle and probably with a different lens or even a different camera, also seems to have been flipped horizontally for aesthetic reasons, creating a sense of spaciousness absent from the other two images. These images date from about a year after home economics moved from its original home at the old agricultural college in the Tuxedo neighborhood of Winnipeg to the Fort Garry campus that eventually became the University of Manitoba. Because of the financial stresses created by the First World War, the construction of the promised home economics building was delayed and would not open until 1950. As a result, the Department of Household Science, later Home Economics, occupied the basement, second and third floors of the administration building. The spatial arrangement of the lab follows the open square model, which had already been employed by 1909 in household science labs in Winnipeg high schools, like the Alexandra School in Winnipeg School Division No. 1, and in the Brandon Central School's Domestic Science Department in 1911. Stationary tables on three sides of the room with gas jets for each student along a metal strip at the back of the table, the teacher's desk on the open end, a table for supplies in the middle, and storage space built into the benches. This setup is a substantial improvement over the original food laboratory apparatus at the Department of Household Science at the old Manitoba Agricultural College. The earliest foods laboratory equipment there, from around 1909-1910, included wood, coal, and gas ranges, plus the then common fireless cooker, or hay box. A 1902 circular from the Winnipeg School of Household Science describes an even earlier food lab as being equipped with 12 desks and Bunsen burners. Home economics pedagogy always explicitly included the selection and care of equipment, and as I said, home economists tracked everything, so we know that in 1919, the equipment from the Alexandra School was transferred to Cecil Rhodes, Gordon Bell, and Hugh John Macdonald schools, and that its estimated worth was still $2,800. Home ec was no different from any other science in terms of its participation in the long and honorable tradition of scrounging for lab equipment. The uniforms in the images I've shown are also an explicit part of the lab apparatus. In 1909, the program required its students to manufacture specific aprons for foods laboratory, sewing, and housekeeping. In the 1950s, students wore an entire white uniform for foods lab, which some home economists continued to wear after graduation while working in the field to project an aura of scientific efficiency. There were also other home ec lab spaces at the University of Manitoba, including, somewhat infamously, the practice apartments and practice houses. A practice housekeeping apartment in the administrative building served as the lab space for courses in materials and household efficiency, which were regularized as a course in household management in 1927. Mrs. L.C. Duncan, who taught this course for years, urged the board to provide proper laboratory facilities, so in 1929, the university rented the Sprague House on the northern edge of the University of Manitoba campus for the department. In 1931, the department took over a second house, the Farm Cottage, which it used until 1939. The Farm Cottage was small and poorly heated, so Ralph Ham designed the Practice House, a new red brick Georgian residence specifically for the Department of Home Economics. In 1957-58, the department opened 4 new home management apartments. So here's the infamous bit, and I quote, 2 children, wards of the Child Welfare Department, also lived in the Sprague House to give student experience in the understanding and care for young children. Between 1929 and 1953, 33 children, mostly infants, lived in the house under the care of Miss Florence McLaughlin, later Mrs. T.R. Brownridge. For a period, it was mandatory for all third-year students to briefly spend time in the house as child director. After 1950, the new home economics building still had a nursery school laboratory. A fictional account of this history appears in Carol Shields' 1992 novel, Republic of Love, and Jessica B. Lineweaver published a whole paper on it in Signs in 2013. So, laboratory, yes, and this was in keeping with a long tradition in the Department of Psychology of animal behaviorist studies that persisted well into the 1980s at the University of Manitoba, when ducklings inside a vitrine in one of the university tunnels were a popular sight. But it's difficult to imagine how a laboratory practice involving the raising of children inside the lab would pass a university ethics committee today. By 1950, when the School of Home Economics finally received its own building, it contained a range of laboratories. The Foods Lab was renovated to include a section equipped for taste testing, and the new demonstration room, like an operating theater, included a large adjustable plate glass mirror over the main table. In 1961, a new textile lab and conditioning room opened, and a second, smaller textile lab for honors and graduate students opened in 1964. By the 1970s, the apparatus of the various home ec labs had become highly sophisticated, including equipment like gas chromatographs, amino acid analyzers, texturometers, weatherometers, allo-Kramer shears, and magnahelix. Many of these devices were part of the textile lab and were used to artificially stress or age fabric samples and then provide precise measurement of the changes they had undergone. As a side note, there is another significant body of photo documentation from this period, though there is less writing about it in the archive. One of the interesting things about this period is that the photographic record suggests a concerted effort on the part of the university to promote not only their sophisticated lab apparatus, but the presence of lab technicians who all had professional headshots taken. This is one possible avenue for ongoing research on this project. From the time of the second household science year, in 1911, enough science was taught to give the student an intelligent understanding of the natural processes which she would encounter in her daily life and a scientific basis for practical studies. From the period of relocation to the Fort Garry campus onward, students took courses in chemistry and bacteriology. In 1929, Miss Louise Pettingale became the first Manitoba Home Economics graduate to teach on the Winnipeg School Board staff. By the mid-1930s, high school home economics students were producing laboratory reports on the experiments they conducted. Meanwhile, at the university, there was a thriving home economics research culture by 1930, producing and disseminating original science. Problems of an experimental nature were carried on at the request of other departments or as part of nutrition studies. Between 1928 and 1934, experimental work on animals was undertaken to demonstrate, for example, the effect of proper food on growth. Around 1940, the University Research Council approved the purchase of equipment for the establishment of the Textile Research Laboratory. There's one more Manitoba Home Economics lab space that I want to discuss today, and at the same time, there's a fact I've withheld about the images with which I opened. First off, the 3 images of the 1914 Foods Lab aren't just photographs, they're postcards. The university wanted these images to circulate and literally wanted people to comment on them. Production doesn't mean much without circulation. Likewise, the other lab spaces that were crucial to the early history of Manitoba and Saskatchewan home economics were the Better Farming Trains, which took the labs directly to the people, presenting new research as well as improved techniques for a range of applications on the farm and in the farmhouse. There were 2 such trains, one provided free with crew by each of the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Railways. Faculty from the Agricultural College, including the Home Economics faculty, traveled throughout the province over the summer. In 1911, as a North American first, a dedicated home economics car was added to the trains. According to the Manitoba Agricultural College calendar for 1912-1913, in 1912 alone, the train staged 150 meetings with over 35,000 people attending. And I have found newspaper reports of such trains running as late as 1927. They were evidently very effective tools and bear a strong family resemblance to the agit trains that the Bolsheviks began using to promote the art and culture of the Revolution after 1918. The circulation of both postcards and trains leads me directly to the expanded aspect of the expanded lab, which only makes sense in the context of a discussion of cultural policy and the kinds of subjects it desires to produce. The trains, for example, were authorized by the Provincial Department of Agriculture and supported by the Dominion government as part of an extremely long-lived and successful policy program known as agricultural extension. At root, extension was about bringing modernity to the prairies through the creation of a scientifically informed population in order to better stimulate agricultural industry. It has its relative beginnings in a series of acts passed by the government of Manitoba over the turn of the century, beginning with an 1872 act to establish agricultural societies, which was expanded the following year to include fairs and agricultural exhibitions. The concern of cultural policy is the relationship of the individual to the state. Rather than brutalize people into obeying, modern democratic policy uses a variety of training regimes to organize and produce, by and large, willingly productive citizen subjects. In 1902, the Agricultural Society Act stipulated that an agricultural society could be established anywhere in the province as long as there were 50 members. A 1906 Act established the degree-granting Agricultural College for Men. W.J. Black, the first president of the college, was not only responsible for home economics and agriculture at the college, but for province-wide extension work. In 1910, an act provided for the creation and organization of home economic societies, which became women's institutes in 1919, and in the same year, the Agricultural College established a diploma course for women, which became the Bachelor of Home Economics degree in 1916. From 1914 to 23, the Manitoba Department of Agriculture supplied a grant under the Dominion Agricultural Instruction Act to finance home economics extension. The grant was withdrawn in 1923, which nearly killed the program. It was kept alive almost single-handedly by Esther Mackay, born Esther Thompson, one of the first graduands of the program and subsequently director of the Home Economics Program. This series of resolutions created the conditions for citizens to emerge who were not only subject to cultural policy, but also active contributors to it and producers of it. In 1911, the Household Science Association in Morris, Manitoba, the first of its kind in Manitoba, founded the previous year, made its first resolution requesting support from Premier Rodmond Roblin. Since this first resolution, Women's Institute members regularly took positions on cultural issues and made significant contributions to provincial cultural policy. By the 1930s, home economists were working in many Manitoba government departments, including Relief and Public Works, Child and Family Welfare, the Prairie Housing Committee, and the Flood Restoration Committee. To produce the productive, modern, scientifically minded farmer citizens that extension required, lab-trained home economics graduates used provincial infrastructure, railways, roads, the electrical and gas grids, the telephone exchange, the newspapers, radio stations, and eventually TV channels, in combination with a series of innovative policy instruments and tools. Now, there's a huge amount to say about this process, but I'm going to briefly mention the ones most relevant to the topic of the lab. Many home economists applied their technological skills by working directly through the provincial infrastructure in a variety of ways. Due to World War II, widespread electrification didn't happen in Manitoba until after the war. Winnipeg City Hydro and Manitoba Hydro, the two utilities providers, directly employed home economists to aid with this process. Extension graduates were involved in the redesign of farm homes to accommodate electricity, remodeling kitchens for new appliances, as well as helping to design and add bathrooms, mudrooms, and farm offices. They also demonstrated the new electrical and gas appliances for shoppers on site and in the hydro store, and the department stores that sold them. Home economists employed by the utilities also served as a pre-digital information network. In addition to authoring publications like cookbooks, writing regular newspaper columns, and appearing on radio and TV, they were available for free public consultation over the phone about any and all domestic questions related to the new technologies. Perhaps the best known of the many policy instruments that Home Economics Extension put in place is the Boys and Girls Clubs, later known as the 4-H clubs. In 1913, 8 Boys and Girls Clubs were formed in rural Manitoba towns. By 1915, there were 28 such clubs, and the 1916 Extension Report stated that they were the most effective way of teaching home economics. Designed for rural youth aged 10 to 21, their stated primary purpose was to convey improvements in agricultural and home economics methods. The mandate to develop the citizen potential of these children by participating in a voluntary activity and to become aware of improved agricultural and home economics technology. The clubs were originally the responsibility of the Assistant Director of Extension, but the program soon required other staff and exists to this day. There's far more to say about the Extended Home Economics Lab than I can cover here today. What I want to emphasize, though, is that the lab space, apparatus, and people in the home ec labs, and any labs really, don't make a lot of sense unless we also take into account the policy questions, infrastructural support, and the various imaginary regimes that position it all, even as they emerge from it. Lab assemblages are flat, and the whole mess emerges by fits and starts in unpredictable ways. The politics of home economics extension are what historian Veronica Strong-Bogue dubs working feminism. It made women and their difficult work a subject for serious study and employed scientific method to produce not only primary research, but new techniques for developing modern, productive subjects, versed in everything from scientific method to parliamentary procedure. For Strong-Bogue, early 20th century home economics had some of the same consciousness raising and research goals as modern, circa 1986 women's studies programs. In the autoethnographies of 20th century prairie home economists, the varieties of feminist politics ranged from the radical to the conservative. But over the course of the century, what began as an effort to ameliorate the work of women in the private sphere passed through the home economics laboratories to become a collective cultural policy agenda. When the University of Manitoba closed the Faculty of Human Ecology on July 1st, 2015, transitioning remaining units to other faculties, a significant century-long part of the project of modernity on the prairies came to an end. Revisiting it by way of the laboratory is only one piece of an ongoing assessment of its complex legacy.
I guess we get started. Are there any questions from the attendees for Liz and Darren?
Hi, my name's Connie. Thanks so much to both of the presenters. I'm here from the Newkirk Center for Science and Society at the University of California, Irvine. So I heard about this conference and just was able to fly out, so super excited to be here. And I am in the process of sort of developing an emergent lab for community-based research, and working mostly with graduate students to help them figure out how to do work in community settings. And I had two main questions. One, Liz, I was really pleased to see you highlighting the work of your students, and I really appreciated that. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more like about the how-to, like what you spend, it's like a lot of students and how you support them, where the money comes from, or if they get funded for their fellowships, kind of how you divide your time among them, like your meetings and stuff like that. And then maybe both of you could speak to what I think the second presentation really touched on was sort of the ways that the structures of the university are influencing or of course shape what we can do and what we expect to do and students to be doing in the future, and especially in thinking about like in the humanities and social sciences, like there's not that many jobs. So thinking about ways that through our labs we're training people to be knowledge workers, not just in the university but elsewhere. So I was wondering if either of you could speak about that.
Sure. So in answer to your first question, it's complicated, and I think often funding involves certain kinds of improvisation. Fortunately, there is existing funding to support some of our related digital humanities projects, like the Lemon Project, which is about legacies of segregation and slavery that the university participated in, and the LGBTIQ Virginians Project, which gathers oral histories and ephemera from queer Virginians in a collaborative way. And we do have a grad assistantship for the Equality Lab itself. One anxiety I have is I feel like the fellows are giving a lot of unpaid labor, which is part of why I really try to highlight their research when I talk about the lab, because I think it's really important to acknowledge the degree to which they are really running the lab rather than I am running the lab. Recently, I wrote a piece for American Quarterly called Against Mentoring, where I talked about kind of the problems with power structures that involve the kind of mentor creating a structure that then gets replicated in the university. And it was interesting that you used the, your students. I'm actually trying to avoid that formulation as much as possible, using terms like lab member, Equality Lab fellow, or my advisee, if it's somebody who I'm actually the PhD advisor for, because I do think that these structures of inequality are perpetuated in everyday language. And I think part of the ways that very precarious graduate students feel a need to affiliate themselves with people with perceived power is something that is really deeply problematic, and that we've tried to think about other models. And in fact, recently, just yesterday, Elizabeth Maddock Dillon and Alana Prince of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive were at the Equality Lab and having lunch with our Equality Lab fellows, talking about ways that, what does it mean to not model becoming yourself, right? What does it mean to think about mentoring from a critical perspective and think about how mentoring often reproduces structures of oppression? So it's kind of a long answer, but it's something I've tried to think about a lot, and a lot of it is trying to give our grad students agency in this space. There's a second question for both of us about institutions.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Institutions are terrible at supporting feminist labs, although, the people in my leadership, we have a new president, Catherine Rowe, who's a digital humanist as well, who's been actually very supportive in the publicizing part. But it's hard because senior administrators might be very supportive rhetorically, but sometimes less supportive infrastructurally.
Just a thought about mentoring and methodology and institutions. The interesting things about doing historical work is you find methods that sort of straddle the inside and outside of the academy. One of the techniques that home economics used pretty successfully over the 20th century is a thing called the local leader model, where you send an extension economist out into a community with a particular set of lesson plans, and they identify 4 or 5 people in a given community. They give a class. 2 weeks later, they come back to give another class, but in the time in between, the people from the first class go back and they reproduce that lesson for as many people as they can inside the community. This is a model that develops sort of early 20th century, and it's been used successfully all over the world. It works best when it takes into account local learning styles and differences in power structures between the way things work, say, inside the university and outside. So I think one of the reasons for looking at these older practices is saying, all right, we have a different situation in classrooms now and in labs now than we used to. Are there tools that exist that might help us figure out those kinds of problems?
Oh, hi, my name is Andy Stewart. I am a first-year PhD student in journalism here at CU Boulder, and my question is, One criticism of the digital humanities is that it's too privileged, i.e. too male or too white, and marginalizes minorities. So how can we use a feminist approach in the digital humanities to encourage creativity and increase agency within fields which tend to lean more towards traditional academic methods and stigmatize alternative forms of knowledge seeking?
So I think the best work being done in the digital humanities today is being done by women of color. So I think often understanding that they are the leaders in the field, and people like Marissa Parham, Catherine Knight Steele, Jessica Marie Johnson, Gabrielle Foreman. There are a lot of really important thinkers and doers, and I think we can learn a lot from them without appropriating their work and just using it without giving them credit. So I think, I would say that's just it's the best work being done in the field, both intellectually and practically, when it comes to digital humanities labs. So, I mean, I'd sort of say that I actually don't think the Equality Lab is the best digital humanities lab out there. I think there's a lot of really great work being done by women of color who are directing labs. That said, we have a lot of women of color in our lab, and part of how we do that is we try to create an inclusive space that's hospitable and generous, and that's often being driven by the women of color in the lab. And people can become fellows, like there's no selection process, right? If you say, I think one of the things Jessica Marie Johnson said, which I think is something I hear in my head all the time, is she says, if you say it's digital humanities, it's digital humanities. And she's sort of using the work of Simone Brown, where she talks about, she said she was free. And I think this, the self-emancipation of identifying yourself as a digital humanist without needing to get permission is, I think, really important.
Hi there. My name's Aaron Vimont. I'm a past student here and employee at CU, and I currently work at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. And I had a question specifically regarding the diplomacy lab that you mentioned and how you're working in conjunction with the State Department and how you kind of balance working, trying to separate yourself from an institution while also working from within it. And in Darren's presentation, he was talking specifically about, or it seemed to be that the state was very, very involved with the lab, very heavy-handedly, and so kind of wondering how you balance working with an imperialist institution like the State Department and potentially promoting their values from within your own lab, which would seem to be antithetical to the purpose of what you're doing at the lab itself.
Yeah, and certainly part of the reason I decided to teach the course was because Zeynep Tufekci's Twitter and Tear Gas had been published, which I thought was a great text to center a course around. So since I had the opportunity for students to have this applied experience where they would actually have an opportunity to talk with State Department officials and see that politics is actually a lot messier than it might look from the outside. Career diplomats have very complicated feelings about the current administration, and that there are also Turkish citizens who work inside the embassy and work on public diplomacy. There certainly were complicated issues to negotiate. One of the hardest issues had to do with finding Turkish speakers, because I don't speak Turkish, and I thought it was really important to make sure that for the student research groups that we had Turkish speakers. And those, by having to solicit the participation of Turkish speakers, that really changed the dynamic of the class, because for a lot of the participants, they were studying in the United States because of very complicated political reasons. And those reasons became part of the class discussion.
Yeah, the Canadian context is always a little bit different because those relationships with the government are different. Pretty much everything is subvented on sub-level in the name of the public good, and sometimes it works and sometimes it's terrible. But the thing that I wanted to note is that it's not a one-way channel. Like if you look at home economics practice over the century that it existed, one of the interesting things about it is that many of the graduates of that program actually end up in active policy formation roles. It's not just lobbying. They go and they work for the government. They write policy, you know, as high-placed government officials or people working in the office in, you know, some adjunct role to policy-forming officials. So it's sort of like, it's Australian cultural studies makes a similar kind of argument. Like in a lot of ways, Canada is a very small place. You can't really separate academics from researchers, from bureaucrats, from citizens, because everybody wears all of the hats at some point in their career, and often more than one of them at once.
Okay, I think we have time for one quick question. I see one right here.
How quick it is. I'm a historian, and so I'm really interested in how the kinds of feminist lab initiatives that are happening here and the research that Darren you're doing kind of interfaces with broad STEAM initiatives, you know, which I would suggest were already happening in home economics at the beginning of the 20th century, and you know, but because you know, kind of the attachment of feminism to this creates a bracket, right, that sort of separates what we're trying to do, I think, you know, from what are seen as very high value propositions in the larger culture. How do we navigate that? You know, I think about something like Amy Bix's work on home economics in the American context, in how that became a place to sort of park women that was not engineering, that was outside of these high value kind of lab positions, you know, that were being created in this time. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
And you also have the research of somebody like Ruth Schwartz Cohen, who's looking at the ways that new household technologies created more labor for women rather than less labor for women. So the sort of presence of technological actors in the domestic sphere created all sorts of new labor constraints.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not a uniformly, you know, positive or unambivalent situation. And I tried to highlight some of the complexity of that, but it's, you know, there was always sort of this sense that home economics was, you know, a kind of secondary discipline that followed behind agriculture. You know, and in the prairies, that's, you know, the thing that you do if you're not an engineer, you go into ag. So that's a very real kind of problem, and I think probably ultimately had something to do with the demise of it as a discipline. But you know, reading through this stuff it's really interesting to me. Like it's all about power, but there's no kind of easy way to separate out the bits that are truly emancipatory from the pieces that cause other problems, right? Which is why I think, you know, a kind of longer, more patient approach to picking apart the historical record is really necessary at this point.
And to answer your question about STEM, I think that shows that this, you know, that feminist work in lab settings and negotiating its relationships with STEM initiatives has a 100-year history. And that's a really vexed history. And I know certainly for the Equality Lab, we do take money for women in STEM kinds of initiatives because it helps support the labor of the graduate students and makes it not free.
Well, thanks so much to our speakers.